All right, hello everybody. Today I will be talking about, um, generally speaking, I'll be talking about a video that I watched just today called Tolkien's Problems with Dune, or Tolkien's Problem with Dune. It's a video by a channel called Jess of the Shire. I'll put a link in the description. She goes through, and she's, I guess, a fan of both Tolkien and Frank Herbert. And she talks about So apparently what happened is that at one point somebody sent a copy of Dune to Tolkien, and then later on someone also sent a copy of Dune to Tolkien, and in Tolkien's return letter he said basically that he disliked Dune to a certain degree. He doesn't explain why, doesn't really go into it, says, it's probably better for me to just stay silent as opposed to, crap on some writer that that is kind of in the same position that I'm in. And so, and this is something that came out in his letters later, obviously, right? So, the basis of this video by Jess of the Shire is that Tolkien disliked Dune, question why. And so she approaches this problem from the four-point structure or four-point outline or four elements of a fairy story that Tolkien believed in and was thought were important, and she kind of applies those four elements both to, a little bit to Lord of the Rings, but mostly to Dune. She's mostly talking about how these four elements that Tolkien thought were very important in fantasy storytelling are dealt with in Dune and how they are dealt with differently compared to Lord of the Rings. So, element number one is fantasy. Basically, fantasy is a well-built secondary world. The world builder uses his skills of logic and rationalization to create a self-contained and consistent world. Now, in both cases, Tolkien and Herbert both created pretty detailed, interesting, layered, nuanced secondary worlds. By the way, I'm making this video now and not right after I looked at Dune, because I want to have both of them not necessarily in the forefront of my mind, but more I want to keep an eye on the things that kind of stuck with me from both of those books, right? Lord of the Rings versus Dune. So that's kind of my perspective here. So that's kind of where we're going. Now, Jess of the Shire says that the basis for Middle-earth in Tolkien was linguistic, which I think is, or she says mostly linguistic or something like that. I think this is, of course, way too simplistic. Tolkien also kind of does a few things that I think are interesting. For one, he kind of highlights, makes more clear the division between good and evil, right? We as opposed to having an endless series of shades of gray and nobody really on the good side and nobody really on the bad side, Tolkien does a pretty good job of saying, yes, there are some bad people here, and but there's a line here, and this line is where it's important, right? Tolkien creates a world that has multiple different areas, right? I mean, just environmentally, the world of Lord of the Rings, Middle Earth, is more complex than Dune, and Tolkien goes on to create many different groups and many different conflicts, including some long-held tensions between, elves and dwarves and humans and all that good stuff. Another point is that Tolkien creates a world where magic and mysticism are very real things. And one of the things that his world helps to highlight is that the abilities of even very simple people, or very, very lowly people, to become great tools for good or for evil, is another important element of the world that Tolkien creates, right? We have Sam, who, is a gardener, but becomes one of the most crucial, positive forces on the world that ever existed. And then we also have, in the books, I forget that guy's name. What was it? He's the guy that kind of almost sells the hobbits out to Mordor back when they're still in back when they're still in the Bree area, right? There's some of that. Then, if you think about it, there are also elements of Tolkien's religiosity that kind of made their way into the world that Tolkien built. We have the Nazgul, who are kind of symbolic of the inherent basic flaws of man leading to eternal torment and damnation. Jess of the Shire goes on to note that Dune's basis for his, or Herbert's basis for Dune's world, there we go, was kind of his wider experience as a journalist. There's a little bit more cynicism in there. There's a little bit more width or broadness in her opinion. I'm not sure that I quite agree with that. I think that she's giving Tolkien. I think she's giving Middle Earth a little bit of a short shrift in this part of her video, and she talks about Dune, about Herbert's focus on ecology, and not just ecology of like environment, but ecology Herbert defined as kind of understanding and accepting the consequences of action. She also notes that maybe Tolkien thought Dune was too clinical. Now, there's an element to this that I think might be true, right? There is a certain clinicalness to Dune, but I think also one of the things that Tolkien could very well have picked up on was the pessimism or even cynicism of Dune. There's something fundamentally uninteresting to me there's something fundamentally uninteresting in looking at a mankind that has reverted to all of its basest and lowest instincts, right? And that's kind of where we are in Dune. Mankind has completely reverted back to basically master-slave relationships on a grand galactic scale. Mankind as little better than beast is fundamentally maybe not less entertaining, right? But less interesting than mankind at his best, even if those shining moments happen to be brief, right? It's that this is what we could be bit that helps to make things like The Lord of the Rings really shine forward. And that little bit of shininess is actually, I think, is important for the next point, which is the second point is recovery, right? The notion that Tolkien has that our everyday lives kind of blind us to the wonder and beauty of the world, that we find something beautiful and we put it away in a closet and we have it, but we don't look at it. Jess of the Shire goes on to talk about things like forgiveness, honor, redemption, and even like basic things like the beauty of trees and stars. And then she notes that Herbert kind of invokes Tolkien recovery, but more toward pessimistic objects. And of course, this, to me, I think is the basic problem. Recovery of evil or mundane things isn't helpful, and it's not really recovery by Tolkien's definition. It kind of defeats the purpose of recovery. If it's like, well, yeah, I mean, I took this blob of silly putty and I put it in a closet. Well, bring out that silly putty blob. Look at it. It's like, well, it's just a blob of silly putty. I don't even remember why I put it in the closet. Similarly, if we are recovering, if we are remembering, or if we are bringing out the worst that mankind has to offer, then we're also kind of focusing on that in a way that, isn't really inspiring in any strong sense of the word. Now, she doesn't actually spend a lot of time on recovery. She moves on to escape, which is the next element, pretty quickly. And what escape is, according to Tolkien, is kind of thinking about the world outside what one can see. Tolkien gave the example of like, well, a man in a prison need not always talk about bars and jailers, something like that. And Jess of the Shire talks about how part of Middle-earth's beauty is that it escapes common modern problems and has a certain purity to it. But I think, again, this is kind of missing part of the point, too, because it's not just an escape from modern problems, it's also an escape from antiquated problems, right? Tolkien's world has a fundamentally gentle side to it. Farming is not portrayed as 12 hours a day grueling labor as it actually kind of is if you actually are doing it in a world without technology. In the same way that and that gentleness helps to move the story forward because we don't spend our time focusing on the everyday toil, right? In the same way, it would be hard to have a story that's simply about a man's daily toils in a factory to achieve mainstream success if that was the only hook, right? This is an accurate portrayal of a long and hard day's work in a factory. Well, if that's all that the book has to it, it's probably not going to sell a lot for entertainment purposes. Jess of the Shire notes that she believes Tolkien kind of despises the grimness of Herbert's depiction of history, or prediction of history. And I kind of have the same feeling, honestly. I mean, what's the point of chronicling the endless tribal wars of chimpanzees? There might be some scientific interest to it, but not really a whole lot of an inspiration to be gathered from it. If mankind's reason, at its best, can't, not just doesn't, right, now, right, not just like, oh, we're in a bad spot, but if humankind, or if mankind cannot ever improve things in a significant way, if every once in a while we just snap back to the absolute worst that we could possibly be, then not only is the book not an escape, but it's also telling us that escape per se is impossible, which is really even more depressing than Dune is, right? At least in Dune, we have the opportunity that Atreides may create in the world. We have the possibility that the world of Arrakis may one day again become green. I mean, it's not really depicted in the first book, but the point is that it is at least there as a goal. We do have the extremely depressing and cynical examination of like this galactic empire that I think is a little bit unrealistic, but there is at least a shining goal out in the distance kind of thing. One of the points that Jess of the Shire makes is that Dune tells us and reminds us that advancement is not necessarily good, and that technology sometimes requires morality to use properly. This is kind of one of those things where it's like it's important to remind ourselves of this sometimes, but that shouldn't be the whole mass of what the story tells you, right? And to a degree, most of that stuff doesn't actually happen in Dune. We don't actually see the whatever they call it, the Butlerian Jihad in Dune. We just hear tales of it, right? So Dune, the book, the first book, the one that I've read, does avoid that in a does avoid that in a reasonable way. But at the same time, it doesn't really give us a lot of hope, and it doesn't really suggest to us that a lot of permanent change can actually happen. And so, it's not really escape in that sense. I mean, Jess of the Shire says that, quote, escape isn't always bright and sunny, but escape into darkness kind of defeats the purpose of what Tolkien visualized escape as. Which isn't to say that sometimes going into the darkness valiantly is not something that people need to do, and something that shouldn't happen in fiction. Certainly it should, but that portion of it is not escape. Brooding is not escape. I mean, we have an example that I was thinking about was like the Shawshank Redemption, right? Certainly the escape has a dark point followed by a light point, but that light point is coming eventually. That's kind of the goal, right? And if it was just going to be the darkness, then that's certainly not the escape part. That's the valiant part. The final element of Tolkien's fairy story idea is consolation. Jess of the Shire states this as kind of like a happy ending. The word that Tolkien made up to describe it is eucatastrophic, EU catastrophic, where EU means good, right? So it's like good catastrophe. Jess of the Shire goes on to talk about Tolkien's religiosity versus Herbert's likely agnosticism, and talks about how Dune puts religion as a central part of human psychology, which is true, but doesn't have the positive view on it, the positive perspective on it that Tolkien had on his religion. I think that kind of is sidestepping the issue of what eucatastrophic is, right? A eucatastrophic ending, to me, if I think about what the word means and what the parts of the word means and what Tolkien, I think, was getting at, is that it's not just a happy ending, but it's an ending where something fundamental has changed for the better, right? It's important that something change for the better. That's part of what this consolation concept, I think, is all about. There has to be some kind of lasting improvement, or if not some lasting improvement, at least the end of some great and pernicious fault, right? We can have the defeat of evil, or we can have the ascendancy of good, or maybe both, but those are the two different elements that can be mixed and matched to make consolation, as opposed to just like, it's all going to be the same. If Dune is just the story of mankind at its worst kind of forever, then there really can't be any fundamental change, because the structure of the world denies the possibility of such a change. There can be slight variations in this gray fog that we're kind of muddling our way through, but nothing ever changes for long and stays that way. The details that occasionally come out of that gray fog might sometimes be entertaining, and Dune is an entertaining book, don't get me wrong. But those bits of structure that sometimes kind of appear out of the gray fog for a few minutes are, by definition, not changes that exist for a long time. They don't change the world or reality or whatever, or even like human perception of things in a positive way for a long time. Jess of the Shire concludes by talking about how in Dune all great forces and plans are man-made, and how humanity is still important, but just a mixed bag. I mean, I think that's missing the point a little bit, or maybe it's putting a layer of whitewash over Dune that I think is maybe more so than is actually present in the book. I mean, humanity can be and is a mixed bag. That's fine. That's not the same thing as no improvement over the course of 1,000 years. I mean, when I was thinking about this last point that she made, I thought about Foundation, actually, Asimov's Foundation. I thought how Foundation is about a temporary fall of mankind and a struggle to shorten and soften that fall, right? In that sense, it's precisely the opposite of Dune. Even the eventual reclamation of Arrakis in Dune seems more like excessive penance than anything else. Why is there such an attachment to this planet? You know, if the religiosity aspects of Dune are man-made and artificial to a degree, why are we so attached to this planet? And when we have a whole galaxy of opportunities that we could be going for instead, right? No one would try to colonize Mercury, oftentimes there are colonies on Mercury in science fiction. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that if you had the choice between a Mercury or another Earth, you choose the other Earth. And in a world where, we have interstellar travel and things like that, not every planet is going to get covered up with people, right? Some of them are going to be like, well, let's move on and see if we find something better. It's the proverbial, used car lot kind of thing, right? I don't know. I will say that this video by Jess of the Shire is an interesting video. I agree with it in some ways, and I disagree with it in other ways, as you've seen through the video. I highly recommend it if you want to think about this topic in a greater detail. It is not a super long video. It's probably about as long as this one will be. It's an interesting thought process, and it's nice to see some of these definitions and stuff like that, and some quotes and so on. So, go check out that video if you feel like it. I'll have a link in the description. That's what I got for today. Next week, we'll be looking at this very strange book called Destination Unknown. It's written by Agatha Christie, but it is not a mystery, it is a thriller. And that is going to be, I think, an important element in the review. Long story short, I think she makes a good case about why Tolkien might have disliked Dune. I think that the kind of pessimism of Dune is definitely an element that makes it less attractive to someone who likes fantasy for the reasons that Tolkien liked fantasy. So with that, I will call it for today. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. If you like this kind of analysis and you want to help the channel out, you know what to do. There will be links and stuff in the description as well. I hope you have a good weekend, and I will see you next time.